Long before clocks marked the hours and town criers carried news through the streets, many communities relied on a single sound to organize their day: the steady, clear tone of a bell. Behind that single tone stood a quiet, highly skilled craft, the work of bell founders. These artisans shaped metal with careful hands, measured proportions with practiced eyes, and created instruments that could carry sound for miles. And yet, despite the importance of their work, the craft itself slowly faded into the background of history. Tonight, we'll explore the world of these forgotten makers, how they worked, what tools they used, how long a single bell could take to complete, and why their knowledge required both precision and patience. It's a peaceful, steady journey into a craft that shaped community life far more than most people realize. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if you lived in that era, would you rather craft the bell, transport it, or be the one who maintained it for the town? Your answers help me decide what calm stories to create next. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into overlooked corners of history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss the next peaceful story. Now, get comfortable. Let's step into the workshop of the medieval bell founder. For most people in medieval towns, a bell was simply a sound, a clear tone carried across fields, markets, and quiet morning streets. They heard it when the day's work began, when traders opened their stalls, when meetings were called, or when travelers approached the town walls. But behind that familiar sound stood a craft practiced by only a small group of specialists. These bell founders lived and worked in spaces that combined the steady routine of a workshop with the intense concentration required to shape metal into something capable of producing a resonant, dependable tone. Their workspace was not dramatic or loud. Rather, it was a place of controlled heat, deliberate movement, and careful attention to detail. The workshop of a bell founder was typically located on the outskirts of a town. This placement was practical. The work involved heat, smoke, and materials that were easier to manage away from crowded streets. When someone stepped into such a workshop, the first thing they noticed was the arrangement of tools: long-handled ladles for melting metal, smooth wooden paddles, casting molds, chisels, hammers of different weights, and carefully kept measuring tools that guided the proportions of each bell. These tools did not look extraordinary at first glance, but each played a specific role in the long and patient process of creating a bell. The workshop's center held a large furnace, built from stone and clay, where the metal would be melted. Unlike the roaring flames that people sometimes imagined, the furnace burned with a steady, controlled heat. The bell founder knew exactly how to manage the temperature, adding fuel in measured amounts, watching the color of the fire, and listening to the subtle changes in the furnace's sound. These details allowed the founder to judge when the metal was ready. That ability did not come from written instructions. It came from years of observation, from experience passed down quietly from older artisans to their apprentices. Before the metal could be heated, the bell founder needed to prepare the mold. This step required as much patience as the melting of the metal itself. The mold determined the bell's shape, size, and ultimately its sound. Even small changes in the thickness of the walls or the curvature of the bell could alter the tone. To begin making the mold, the founder shaped a core from clay mixed with fibers and fine sand. This mixture allowed the core to withstand heat while maintaining its structure. The core was smoothed carefully with wooden tools, shaping it to the exact measurements needed for that particular bell. Over the core, the founder built what was called the false bell, a temporary structure that served as the space where the final shape would be formed. This false bell was also made from clay, built layer by layer and shaped with the same slow, consistent motions practiced for generations. Once completed, the founder coated it with a mixture of ash and water, creating a fine surface that could later be removed without affecting the final mold beneath it. This attention to detail showed how the craft balanced simplicity and precision, two qualities that defined the bell founder's work from start to finish. When the false bell dried fully, the founder added decorative lines or inscriptions if the town requested them. These details had nothing to do with ceremony. They were purely practical markers, lines indicating direction, marks identifying the year of casting, and symbols that helped communities remember who made the bell. Because written records were not common for everyday crafts, these markings were a way for the founder to preserve information directly on the object itself. Next came the mantle, The outer layer of the mold. Clay was applied again, this time in thicker layers designed to withstand the extreme temperatures of molten metal. The founder spread the clay evenly, smoothing it carefully as it dried. Once the mantle reached the necessary thickness, the founder lifted it away, revealing the false bell beneath. With slow, practiced movements, the founder broke the false bell apart and removed it piece by piece, leaving behind the hollow space where the molten metal would soon flow. That space represented the exact shape of the final bell. Throughout this process, the workshop maintained a steady rhythm. Apprentices ground clay, mixed sand, carried wood for the furnace, and prepared tools. Their movements followed a familiar sequence, each step predictable and unhurried. The bell founder, meanwhile, inspected every detail, the alignment of the mold, the thickness of the walls, the dryness of each layer. Nothing was rushed. The craft demanded patience because mistakes could take days to correct. A poorly shaped mold meant starting over. Even a small crack could compromise the structure. Only when the mold was fully prepared did the founder begin melting the metal. Most bells were made from bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. The proportions mattered greatly. Too much copper would create a dull sound, while too much tin made the metal too brittle. The founder measured the metals carefully, based on knowledge gained from earlier castings. These measurements were not written down. They were remembered through experience, refined through years of listening to different tones, observing how metal cooled, and learning how slight variations affected the final product. As the metal melted in the furnace, the workshop grew warmer but not chaotic. Apprentices moved with focus, adding fuel to maintain temperature or adjusting vents that controlled the flow of air. The founder used long-handled tools to stir the molten metal gently, watching closely as impurities rose to the surface. These impurities were skimmed off carefully, leaving a cleaner alloy behind. The clarity of the metal influenced the clarity of the bell's sound, so this step required meticulous attention. When the metal reached the correct consistency, judged by color, thickness, and motion, the founder prepared for the casting. Molten metal was poured from the furnace into large ladles, then carried slowly toward the mold. This moment required complete coordination. Apprentices steadied the ladles with practiced hands, ensuring the metal did not cool too quickly or spill. The founder directed each pour, controlling the speed so the metal filled the mold evenly. As the molten bronze flowed into the hollow space of the mold, a low, steady sound filled the workshop. Not loud, but unmistakable. The metal settled gradually, reaching every curve and detail of the mold's interior. The founder watched quietly, ensuring that the metal reached the top without gaps or trapped air. Once the mold was full, the workshop entered a new phase, waiting. The cooling process could take days, especially for larger bells. During that time, the workshop remained active with other tasks, but the mold itself was left undisturbed. The founder occasionally checked the outer surface, feeling the temperature with a careful touch. The cooling had to be slow and even. If the metal cooled too quickly, it could crack. If it remained too warm for too long, the structure could weaken. The founder judged these conditions through a combination of experience and patient observation. When the time finally came to break the mold open, the entire workshop seemed to pause. Apprentices gathered around, tools ready. The founder began removing the outer clay layer with steady hands. Piece by piece, the mantle came away, revealing the bell beneath. At first, the metal looked dull, covered with residue from the mold. But as the founder chipped away the remaining clay, the bell's surface emerged, smooth, curved, and complete. The bell did not ring yet. Before it could produce a sound, it needed finishing. The founder inspected the interior, checking for imperfections or uneven thickness. Even small irregularities could affect resonance. With careful chiseling, the founder corrected these details. The shaping of the bell's interior was a delicate process, balancing precision with restraint. Too much chiseling could weaken the structure. Too little could produce a muted or unbalanced tone. Finally, when the bell was cleaned, shaped, and prepared, the founder performed the first test. This test did not involve swinging the bell. It was simply a gentle tap using a small wooden mallet. The sound that followed was soft but distinct. The founder listened closely, hearing not just the note itself, but the way it resonated through the metal. This sound told the founder everything. Whether the proportions were correct, whether the metal had cooled evenly, whether the shape was balanced. If the tone was steady and clear, the bell was considered successful. If adjustments were needed, they were made thoughtfully. The founder never rushed this final stage. The bell's tone was its purpose, its identity, and the result of every decision made in the workshop. When the bell was finally complete, apprentices polished its surface and prepared it for transport. The bell's weight often required multiple workers to move it. They lifted it using wooden frames, ropes, or carts designed to distribute the load evenly. The process of transporting the bell might take hours or even a full day, depending on distance and terrain. For the founder, watching the bell leave the workshop brought a quiet sense of accomplishment. Each bell represented weeks of work: shaping, measuring, melting, casting, cooling, refining. Yet the founder knew that once the bell reached its destination, it would belong to the community, not the workshop. Its tone would guide daily routines, marking time, signaling gatherings, or announcing important news. It would travel far beyond the boundaries of the workshop, carrying with it the quiet skill and patient craft of its maker. And while many people heard the bell without wondering how it had been made, the founder understood every detail of its creation, every step of the process, every decision, every moment of waiting. The bell's sound was simple and clear, but behind it stood an entire world of practice, knowledge, and calm precision. This chapter marks the beginning of our journey into the forgotten craft of bell founders, a world shaped not by spectacle, but by steady hands, patient minds, and quiet expertise. Long before a bell could take its final shape, before clay was molded into curves or furnaces were prepared for casting, bell founders faced one of the most important decisions in the entire process: choosing the metal. This step shaped everything that would follow: the tone, the strength, the longevity, and even the reliability of the bell depended on selecting the correct mixture of metals and preparing them with the patient care that defined this craft. For most people living in medieval towns, metal was simply part of daily tools: iron for hinges, copper for pots, tin for small household items. But in the hands of a bell founder, metal became something far more delicate, requiring attention not just to quantity and quality, but also to age, color, texture, and consistency. Bronze was the preferred metal for most bells. It had the ideal combination of strength and resonance, producing tones that carried clearly through open spaces without distorting. But bronze was not a single metal. It was a mixture, an alloy primarily consisting of copper and tin. Even small changes in the proportion of these metals could dramatically alter the bell's sound. Too much copper produced a sound that was soft and muted. Too much tin made the bell brittle, causing it to produce a tone that felt sharp or unstable. Finding the perfect balance required experience, not guesswork. Copper arrived at the workshop in the form of ingots or plates, depending on the region. Tin often came in smaller blocks, easier to measure and store. Both metals had their own characteristics, and a founder learned to recognize quality through close inspection. Copper varied slightly in color depending on where it was mined. Some batches had a brighter red hue, while others leaned toward a deeper, more muted shade. Skilled founders examined copper in natural light, tilting each piece slowly and watching how it reflected. Brightness suggested purity. Uneven coloration hinted at unwanted impurities. Tin was examined differently. It was softer, easily scratched, and tested with gentle pressure. A founder could estimate its purity by pressing a thumb along the surface and observing how the metal responded. A slight but steady resistance indicated good tin. If the surface flaked or crumbled, the batch contained unwanted elements that could weaken the alloy. Metal traders sometimes attempted to hide imperfections by coating tin with smoother outer layers, but experienced founders knew how to check for this. They scraped small portions from edges or weighed pieces in their hands to compare density. Over years of practice, a founder developed an instinctive ability to judge quality without hesitation. Once the metals were selected, the next challenge was determining how much of each to use. A typical mixture contained a higher proportion of copper with a smaller amount of tin, but this ratio was never identical across all bells. The size, thickness, and intended tone influenced the proportions. Smaller bells often required slightly more tin to produce a brighter sound, while larger bells needed more copper to maintain strength and resonance. A founder did not decide this by consulting written measurements. Instead, decisions came from memory shaped by decades of listening to bells, studying their tones, and learning from each casting. The founder used simple tools to weigh the metal. Scales were balanced with stone or metal weights, each carefully labeled. The founder placed copper pieces on one side, adjusting them until they matched the desired weight. Tin was added separately, using smaller weights to ensure precision. These measurements took time because even small inconsistencies could affect the final tone. Apprentices often assisted during this step, carefully handing the founder each piece of metal. They learned by watching, noting how the founder inspected each ingot, how much time was spent balancing weights, and how carefully each decision was made. Before melting, the metals underwent cleaning. This step was essential because even high-quality metals carried small traces of dirt, dust, or oxidation. The founder used coarse cloths or brushes to polish the metals, removing debris. Sometimes, the founder heated the copper briefly to burn away surface impurities, then allowed it to cool before washing it with water. This cleaning ensured that the molten bronze would be as pure as possible, reducing the need to skim impurities later during melting. The clean metals were then separated into smaller batches. This allowed the founder to melt them in stages, maintaining better control over temperature. Copper required higher heat to melt than tin, so copper always entered the furnace first. The founder watched the copper carefully as it softened, then liquefied. Tin was added later, at the precise moment when the copper reached the correct temperature. This process required careful attention because adding tin too early could cause it to evaporate or burn, weakening the alloy. Adding it too late prevented the metals from blending smoothly. Inside the furnace, the melting process unfolded slowly. The founder used long-handled tools to stir the liquid metal gently. Stirring was not vigorous but steady and deliberate, ensuring that the tin dispersed evenly throughout the copper. The mixture glowed with a deep, bright color that shifted gradually as it neared readiness. The founder judged this not just by sight, but by listening. Molten metal made certain soft, distinct movements as it reached proper consistency. The founder recognized these subtle sounds, using them as cues to continue stirring or adjust the furnace. As impurities rose to the surface, the founder skimmed them off with a shallow ladle. These impurities, called dross, consisted of oxidized metal fragments and remnants of dust or dirt. Removing them was crucial. If dross was allowed to cool with the metal, it created imperfections in the bell structure. The founder repeated the skimming process multiple times, working with patience until the molten bronze formed a smooth, reflective surface. The workshop grew warmer during this stage, but the heat remained controlled. Apprentices added fuel to the furnace in steady intervals, avoiding sudden changes. The founder occasionally checked the temperature by placing long metal rods into the molten bronze. The color of the rod when removed, whether glowing orange, dull red, or deep gray, guided the founder's next decisions. This technique, simple but reliable, allowed the founder to fine-tune the furnace with surprising accuracy. Meanwhile, the mold prepared earlier awaited the metal. The interior of the mold had been coated with a fine layer of ash or sand to prevent the molten bronze from sticking. Before pouring, the founder inspected the mold again, running a hand along the outer surface to check for cracks. Even the smallest flaw could compromise the entire casting. If necessary, the founder applied additional clay or sand, smoothing it carefully. Once satisfied, the founder instructed apprentices to position the mold securely. When the metal reached the desired consistency, the founder prepared for transport. The molten bronze was transferred from the furnace into large ladles or crucibles. Each ladle required multiple apprentices to carry it. They moved steadily, using coordinated steps to prevent sudden motion. The founder guided them with calm voice commands, reminding them to breathe steadily and keep their arms balanced. The journey from furnace to mold was short but required complete focus. Pouring the metal into the mold was one of the quietest, yet most significant moments in the workshop. The molten bronze flowed with a soft, steady hiss, filling the hollow interior. The founder controlled the speed carefully, ensuring that the metal distributed evenly. Too fast, and air bubbles might form. Too slow, and the metal could cool prematurely. The founder leaned slightly forward, eyes focused on the flow, making subtle adjustments as needed. Once the mold was filled, the surface of the molten bronze shimmered lightly, settling into place. The founder allowed the mold to rest. Cooling began immediately, but the real transformation, The shaping of metal into its final form required days. The founder covered the mold with insulating materials to control the cooling rate, preventing cracks or weak points from forming. During the cooling period, the workshop continued its regular rhythm. Apprentices prepared new clay for future molds, cleaned tools, and repaired equipment. The founder often spent this time organizing materials for upcoming projects or examining previous bells to compare tones. Even when the workshop was busy, the presence of the cooling mold remained central, a quiet reminder of the complex process unfolding beneath its surface. As the days passed, the founder checked the mold periodically. The temperature dropped gradually, and each inspection helped determine when it was safe to break the mold open. When the moment finally arrived, the founder gathered the apprentices. With slow, deliberate taps of small hammers, they broke away the clay, revealing the newly formed bell inside. The bell's surface bore marks from the mold, traces of clay, lines formed by seams, and the first signs of its final shape. But before it could ring, it needed refinement. The founder inspected the metal closely, looking for signs of even cooling. The sound of the bell would ultimately reflect the success of this entire process. Choosing the metal, selecting it, testing it, cleaning it, melting it, blending it, represented the foundation of the craft. Without this careful preparation, no amount of shaping or finishing could produce a clear, steady tone. The founder's knowledge of metal, gained through years of experience, formed the invisible structure behind every bell, a structure rooted not in words or records but in memory, discipline, and quiet patience. For a bell founder, the mold was more than just a container for molten metal. It was the true beginning of the bell's voice. Everything depended on this stage. The tone, the clarity, the strength, and even the lifespan of a bell were determined long before bronze was poured into the furnace. The mold shaped the bell's body, defined its thickness, created its contours, and set the proportions that would allow it to resonate clearly across markets, fields, or quiet town mornings. Because of this, the process of building a mold was slow, steady, and deeply methodical. It was a craft that balanced geometry, material knowledge, physical skill, and the founder's ability to observe subtle details. The earliest step in creating the mold involved selecting the right clay. Bell founders did not use just any clay. They sought mixtures with the correct balance of firmness and flexibility. Too soft, and the mold would warp under the weight of molten metal. Too brittle, and it would crack during drying or pouring. Founders often gathered clay from riverbanks or purchased it from traders who specialized in supplying workshops. They examined the clay carefully, pressing it between their fingers, feeling its grain, and checking how easily it could be shaped. Experienced founders could distinguish quality clay instantly through touch alone. Before using the clay, the founder mixed it with sand, straw fibers, or crushed shells to create a composite material capable of withstanding heat. This mixture gave the mold strength while allowing it to expand and contract without breaking. Apprentices typically prepared these mixtures, kneading them with their hands or using wooden paddles to blend them thoroughly. The mixture had to be consistent. Any unevenness could introduce weak spots. As the apprentices worked, the founder supervised, occasionally testing the clay with a slow, bending motion. If it held its shape without cracking, it was ready. To begin constructing the mold, the founder shaped the core, which formed the inner surface of the bell. This core determined the bell's thickness and internal geometry. It was built on a circular foundation made from wood or packed earth. The founder placed a wooden spindle at the center of this foundation, a sturdy pole that acted as the axis for shaping. Attached to the spindle was a wooden board, carved to reflect the inner profile of the bell. This board, called a strickle, functioned like a guiding arm. As the founder rotated it around the spindle, it shaved and smoothed the clay, ensuring perfect symmetry. The process of forming the core was slow and repetitive. The founder added clay layer by layer, pressing each handful firmly to avoid air pockets. After building a rough shape, the founder used the strickle to refine it, scraping away excess clay and revealing the smooth curve of the bell's inner form. This repetition, adding clay, smoothing, adding more, then smoothing again, defined the early rhythm of mold making. It could take hours just to complete the first shaping and days to perfect it. The core then needed to dry. Drying was one of the most sensitive steps. The founder never exposed the mold to direct heat. Instead, Drying happened gradually in the workshop's steady warmth. If the core dried too quickly, cracks would form. If it dried too slowly, the clay might sag or lose its shape. Apprentices tended to the mold by checking for small imperfections, repairing cracks immediately with fresh clay, and smoothing the surface with cloth or fine sand. The founder, meanwhile, monitored the process quietly, running a hand along the surface each morning to feel how firm it had become. Once the core dried completely, the next step was creating the false bell. This was a temporary layer that represented the bell's outer surface. It was built over the core, using wax or finer clay mixtures that could be removed later. The false bell had to match the final bell's shape exactly. Every curve, every line, every taper had to be precise. The founder used a second strickle board for this step, carved to match the bell's external geometry. As with the core, the founder rotated the strickle around the spindle repeatedly, creating a smooth, perfectly shaped outer layer. During this stage, the founder added features that would later influence the bell's function. If the bell required a specific lip thickness to improve resonance, the founder shaped it carefully along the lower edge. If the bell needed reinforcement rings, small, raised bands around the body, they were applied as compact clay coils and smoothed until they became seamless. Even tiny decorative lines, often simple and geometric, were carved carefully at this stage. These markings were not ornamental. They served as visual guides for the final shaping process and identified the bell in the workshop's records. After the false bell dried, the founder coated it with a fine layer of ash. This ash prevented clay from sticking during the next step. Once the ash layer was applied, the founder constructed the mantle, the final outer mold. The mantle had to be strong enough to contain molten bronze without shifting or cracking. Clay was applied once again, this time in thicker layers, each one compacted carefully. Apprentices carried buckets of clay mixture and applied it under the founder's guidance. The layers were built up gradually, like the walls of a structure, forming a sturdy shell around the false bell. The mantle took days to complete. As each layer dried, the founder added the next, ensuring consistent thickness. The mantle's strength depended on this slow, methodical layering. Once complete, the mantle looked like a large, rounded dome, thick and solid, with a smooth outer surface. The next stage required separating it from the false bell beneath. This step demanded careful coordination. Apprentices helped lift the mantle slowly, rocking it gently until it loosened. When it finally rose, the false bell remained on the core. With the mantle removed, the founder dismantled the false bell. Clay layers were scraped away, leaving behind the hollow space between the core and the mantle, the space that would eventually hold molten bronze. This hollow space represented the bell's exact shape. The founder inspected it with a combination of sight and touch, checking for smoothness, ensuring that no loose bits of clay remained. The cavity had to be flawless. Even small irregularities could affect the bell's tone. The core and mantle were then dried thoroughly again. This drying process was even more delicate than before. The core, having been disturbed by removing the false bell, needed time to settle. The mantle, now hollow and thinner than before, needed to strengthen. The founder positioned both pieces near the furnace's heat, but not too close. The drying took place over multiple days. Apprentices turned the pieces slowly, ensuring even exposure to warmth. While the mold dried, the founder prepared channels for the bronze to flow through. These channels, called gates, guided molten metal into the cavity. They were shaped from wax or clay and positioned with exact angles to ensure smooth, uninterrupted flow. Vent holes were added to allow air to escape during pouring. These vents prevented pressure buildup, which could cause cracks. Each channel and vent represented a small but critical decision. The founder arranged them based on experience, knowing where the metal would cool fastest and how it would move within the mold. Once the mold was dry, the founder assembled it. The core was placed on a steady platform. The mantle was lowered over it slowly, with apprentices guiding each side to ensure perfect alignment. When the mantle rested in place, the mold resembled a sealed container. The hollow shape inside awaited bronze. The founder sealed the edges with clay, pressing it gently into gaps to prevent leakage. The mold now stood ready for casting, a moment that held both anticipation and calm certainty. The founder knew that every decision leading up to this point, every stroke of the strickle, every layer of clay, every drying interval would determine the bell's success. Before pouring the bronze, the founder inspected the mold one final time. Hands brushed lightly across its surface. Fingers tapped gently, listening for hollow or uneven sounds. Any flaw, even hours before casting, could still be corrected. This final check represented the founder's trust in the craft, a trust built on years of careful observation. The mold, now complete, embodied the quiet geometry at the heart of bell founding. It represented the intersection of science, craftsmanship, and patience. It held not just the shape of the bell, but the promise of its future voice, a voice that would carry across towns and valleys, shaped entirely by the clay, the measurements, and the founder's steady hands. This chapter marks a deeper look into the structure that made a bell possible. Without this mold, without this careful shaping, no amount of metalwork could produce a clear tone. The mold was the silent architect of every bell, a structure built slowly, shaped thoughtfully, and preserved with respect for the craft. Among all the stages in the craft of bell founding, none demanded as much quiet focus, careful timing, and controlled movement as the moment of the pour. This was the point where weeks of work, selecting metal, preparing clay, shaping molds, drying layers, and checking details, all came together. A single mistake during the pour could undo everything. That is why bell founders approached this stage with steady nerves and practiced discipline. There was no rushing, no dramatic gestures, and no unnecessary noise in the workshop. The atmosphere became noticeably calmer, as if everyone instinctively understood that this was the moment when the craft demanded its highest concentration. The workshop prepared for the pour in slow, deliberate steps. The furnace, which had already been active for hours, now burned with a steady, controlled intensity. The molten bronze inside glowed with a deep, consistent brightness. This brightness was more than visual. It carried information that experienced founders understood immediately. The color indicated temperature, revealing how ready the metal was for pouring. A slightly duller glow meant the bronze needed a little more heat. A brighter, almost shimmering glow meant the balance was perfect. Bell founders did not rely on written measurements. They trusted their eyes, ears, and long experience. Before any metal could leave the furnace, the mold had to be prepared and warmed. A cold mold could crack when touched by molten bronze, so the founder positioned it near the furnace hours beforehand. Apprentices placed wooden planks under the mold's base to keep it stable, then shielded its outer layer with cloth to prevent uneven drying. The founder walked around the mold multiple times, checking for tiny imperfections, smoothing clay where needed, and tapping lightly on the sides to listen for inconsistencies. A steady, even sound told the founder the mold was ready. While the mold warmed, apprentices organized the tools required for the pour. Long-handled ladles, reinforced with iron bands, rested on wooden supports. These ladles were not elegant tools. They were heavy, practical instruments designed to handle extreme heat. Apprentices inspected the handles, checking for splits or looseness. They prepared thick gloves made from layered fabrics and placed wooden boards near the furnace for stability. The founder moved slowly between these preparations, offering occasional instructions, but always maintaining a quiet, controlled pace. As the moment approached, the workshop shifted into an almost ceremonial stillness. Not symbolic, simply practical. Quick movements could cause accidents, spills, or uneven distribution of metal. The founder approached the furnace, observing the bronze one last time before giving a simple, calm nod to the apprentices. This nod signaled readiness, not urgency. Apprentices took their positions, gripping the ladles with both hands, their bodies aligned in unison. The furnace doors were opened with care. A wave of warm air rolled out, carrying a deep, metallic scent. The bronze inside moved smoothly, forming gentle ripples across its surface. The founder used a long metal rod to stir the alloy one final time, ensuring consistency. Impurities that had risen to the top were skimmed away with a shallow ladle. This skimming required slow, steady motion. Shaking the bronze even slightly could trap air bubbles that would later affect the bell's tone. Once the founder was satisfied, the apprentices lifted the first ladle into the furnace. The metal poured into it with a soft, controlled flow, filling the ladle to the level the founder indicated. The apprentices carried the ladle together, walking in small, synchronized steps. The founder walked beside them, watching both their movements and the metal's behavior. The molten bronze produced a faint sound as it shifted, a low, steady tone that founders knew well. Reaching the mold, the apprentices positioned the ladle carefully above the pouring gate. The founder crouched slightly, checking the angle. Then came the pour itself, a moment requiring complete harmony between the metal, the mold, and the founder's movements. The bronze flowed out in a thin, continuous stream. It struck the inner surface of the mold with a soft, controlled hiss, filling the narrow channels first before spreading into the larger cavity. The founder adjusted the angle of the ladle gradually, ensuring the flow remained steady. Too fast, and the metal could disturb the mold. Too slow, and it could cool before reaching the deepest parts of the cavity. Apprentices watched the founder's hands closely, mirroring each subtle adjustment. When the first ladle emptied, the founder signaled quietly, and the apprentices carried it back to the furnace. Another ladle arrived moments later, continuing the pour without interruption. This continuity was essential. The entire cavity had to fill at a consistent temperature. Any pause, even a brief one, could create seams or internal weaknesses. As more bronze flowed, the workshop seemed to narrow its focus around the mold. Apprentices adjusted their stance. The founder's eyes remained fixed on the metal. The mold itself, warmed and prepared, accepted the bronze gradually, its interior filling with the glow of molten metal. Steam rose from small vents designed to allow air to escape. These vents were placed strategically, based on the founder's experience with previous bells. Each vent released air without allowing metal to escape, ensuring that the bronze occupied the entire cavity evenly. As the final ladle drained, the founder tilted it slowly, letting the last few drops fall into the gate. Then the ladle was lifted away gently. The founder stepped back, observing the newly filled mold. A shimmering layer of molten bronze rested at the top of the gate, slowly cooling. Apprentices placed protective boards nearby, but did not touch the mold. The founder watched the metal settle, noting the way the surface shifted as it began to solidify. The workshop air changed subtly during cooling. The heat from the mold radiated outward, creating a warm boundary around it. Apprentices remained at a respectful distance. The founder listened, not for dramatic noises, but for the soft signals of contraction and settling. A well-made mold cooled evenly, producing faint, rhythmic settling sounds that indicated the bronze was filling its shape correctly. Cooling took far longer than pouring. Hours passed before the top layer hardened. Days passed before the mantle and core reached a safe temperature. During this time, the mold remained untouched. The founder resisted any temptation to hurry the process. Quick cooling risked cracks. Slow cooling produced strong, reliable metal. The founder often reminded apprentices that this stage was just as important as any physical action. While the bell cooled, the workshop continued its everyday rhythm. Tools were cleaned. Clay was prepared for future molds. Furnace ashes were removed and stored. The founder worked on small repairs, occasionally glancing toward the cooling mold. Experience had taught them that patience during this phase was essential. A bell's tone depended heavily on how slowly and evenly it cooled. After several days, sometimes a week, depending on the bell's size, the founder finally approached the mold for the next stage. The mantle felt firm and cool. The air around it carried no residual heat. These signs told the founder it was time to open the mold. The founder did not rush. Using small tools, apprentices gently tapped the mantle, cracking the outer layer. Clay fragments began to fall away, revealing the bell beneath. At first, the bell appeared dull, covered in residual clay and darkened by heat. But the shape was unmistakable, smooth, curved, and solid. Removing the core required even more care. The founder worked from the bottom upward, breaking away clay little by little. Once complete, the bell stood free for the first time. Apprentices carefully cleaned it, brushing away dust and smoothing the surface. The founder inspected the bell, checking thickness, curve, and seam quality. Every detail reflected decisions made during pouring. The bell did not ring yet. That would come later. But the founder already knew much from its surface. The evenness of the metal, the clarity of the shape, and the smoothness of the interior told the founder the pour had succeeded. This was the quiet triumph of the craft, a moment shaped not by dramatic sound or spectacle, but by the calm, disciplined movement of molten bronze guided with confidence and experience. The pour may have lasted only minutes, but it reflected the knowledge of years, a knowledge preserved not in written instructions, but in the steady hands and patient observation of the bell founder. When the molten bronze settled into the mold and the steady glow faded from its surface, the most delicate stage of the bell founding process began: cooling. This phase was neither dramatic nor quick, and it demanded a level of patience that defined the identity of every skilled bell founder. The metal, still soft within the mold, needed time to contract slowly, adjusting to its new shape. The founder knew that inside the clay shell, the bronze was undergoing a silent transformation, one that could not be hurried without risking the clarity and strength of the future bell. Cooling began the moment the last ladle of bronze entered the mold. The workshop grew quieter. Apprentices cleaned tools, swept the workspace, or prepared materials for future work, but they moved with a reserved attentiveness. The heat radiating from the mold made its presence known, forming a warm boundary that no one crossed. The founder remained alert, not distracted but calmly aware of how the mold behaved. They knew from experience that the first hour after pouring was crucial. Even a small shift in the mold's position during this early stage could create uneven walls or subtle warping. That is why the mold was placed on a stable foundation, usually a sand-packed pit or a thick wooden platform, to ensure it remained undisturbed. Hours passed, and the bright glow at the top of the pouring gate slowly dulled into a darker shade. The founder approached periodically, placing a hand near the mold to sense the remaining heat. They never touched the clay directly. It could still be too warm to handle, but the warmth radiating outward gave them all the information they needed. As long as the mold remained hot, the founder resisted any temptation to accelerate the process. Patience, they knew, produced stronger, more reliable bells. The workshop continued operating around the cooling mold in a steady rhythm. Apprentices repaired tools, ground clay for future projects, and skimmed ashes from the furnace that had powered the pour. The founder observed their work occasionally, but kept much of their attention on the mold. Even the apprentices, especially those with less experience, felt the importance of this moment. They did not expect immediate results, knowing well that the craft's most crucial work often happened quietly and invisibly. As the days passed, the mold gradually released its heat. The founder tapped the outer clay lightly, listening for subtle variations in sound. A mold nearing readiness produced a deeper, more stable tone when touched. The founder's ear, trained over years of work, recognized these signals. Apprentices who had been with the workshop long enough knew better than to ask how these sounds differed. The knowledge came only with time, through listening to hundreds of molds cooling in different seasons and temperatures. Finally, after several days, sometimes nearly a week for larger bells, the founder determined the mold was ready to be opened. This moment, though not dramatic, carried a quiet satisfaction. The founder gathered the apprentices and explained the process once more, not out of necessity, but to reinforce the discipline behind the craft. Breaking the mold was not about revealing the bell quickly. It was about ensuring that the bell's surface remained intact and that the clay fell away gradually, without damaging the bronze underneath. The apprentices retrieved small chisels, brushes, and wooden mallets. The founder approached the mold first, tapping gently along the upper edge of the mantle. Thin cracks appeared in the clay, spreading slowly outward. These cracks guided the apprentices, who began loosening sections of the mantle piece by piece. Dust rose into the air, and the faint, earthy smell of dried clay filled the workshop. As more clay fell away, the bell's shape became visible, a silhouette emerging from a shell that had protected it in its earliest days. When the mantle fully separated, the apprentices lifted its heavier pieces aside. The bell, now exposed, bore the rough outer residue left behind by the mold. Its surface was discolored from heat, covered in a mixture of clay dust and oxidized bronze. But underneath, the bell's shape was unmistakable, curved, smooth, and solid. Next came removing the core. This required even more care. The core supported the bell from within during casting, and it needed to be removed slowly to avoid scratching or damaging the interior surface. The apprentices worked through a small opening at the base, breaking the clay inward. The founder watched closely, stepping in when necessary to guide the process. Bit by bit, the core crumbled away, leaving the bell hollow and ready for refinement. With the bell free, apprentices cleaned it thoroughly. Brushes removed clay dust from the outer surface. Fine wet cloths wiped away residue. The founder checked the bell's shape carefully, examining the curve of the mouth, the thickness of the walls, and the smoothness of the interior. All of these details determined how successful the casting had been. But even with a well-made mold and a precise pour, the bell still needed tuning. In founding, tuning did not involve complex machinery. Instead, it relied on careful observation and consistent technique. The founder tapped the bell lightly with a wooden mallet, listening to the tone that resonated from within. This tone, still soft and faint, provided the founder's first glimpse of how the bell might sound once hung in place. The founder listened not just for the pitch, but for the quality of resonance, whether the sound remained steady, whether it faded too quickly, or whether it carried the faint wavering that indicated uneven thickness. If the bell required adjustments, the founder used chisels to shave small amounts of metal from precise areas on the inner surface. These adjustments were tiny, often no thicker than a fingernail, but they could shift the tone noticeably. The founder knew exactly where to work, closer to the lip for certain adjustments, higher near the shoulder for others. Apprentices observed from a respectful distance, understanding that this stage represented the height of the founder's expertise. There was no room for guesswork. Every motion was deliberate. After each adjustment, the founder tapped the bell again and listened. The tone gradually grew steadier, clearer, and more stable as the founder corrected small imperfections. Sometimes tuning took only a few minutes. Other times, it required an hour or more of precise work. But the founder remained patient, knowing that sound was the true test of the bell's success. Once the bell reached a stable, clear tone, the founder nodded quietly, a sign that the bell was ready. Apprentices polished the surface, bringing out the bronze's natural shine. Cloths, brushes, and fine abrasives smoothed any remaining residue. As the surface brightened, the bell's final character emerged. The founder checked the tone one last time, ensuring consistency. Only when completely satisfied did they consider the bell complete. Transporting the finished bell required coordination. Larger bells needed wooden frames and multiple workers. Smaller ones were carried more easily, but still with caution. Bells were not fragile, but they were precision-made. Any dent or sudden impact could alter the resonance. For this reason, the founder supervised loading, watching as apprentices secured ropes, adjusted the frame, and lifted the bell with steady, practiced movements. When the bell finally left the workshop, it represented far more than its weight in metal. It carried the memory of every step in the process. The careful selection of bronze, the shape of the mold, the patient drying, the steady pour, the days of cooling, and the final tuning. Each bell bore the founder's quiet craftsmanship, even if few people ever knew the full extent of the work behind it. The communities that received these bells relied on them daily. Their tones shaped morning routines, marked gatherings, signaled time for work, and provided structure in places where mechanical clocks were rare. And though many people heard these tones without wondering how the bells were made, the founder never forgot. Every sound, clear and steady, echoed the craft itself, patient, precise, and quietly resilient. The journey from raw metal to finished bell was long and exacting, but the founder accepted each step not as labor, but as a practice shaped by years of experience. Cooling, revealing, and tuning brought the bell to life, not through haste or dramatic action, but through steady dedication and deep understanding of the craft. When a bell finally left the workshop, its journey was far from over. In fact, for many bell founders, the transportation stage represented one of the most delicate parts of the craft. A bell, once completed, was strong enough to last for centuries, but still sensitive to sudden impacts or careless handling. Its tone could change noticeably from a single dent, or even from shifting during travel on uneven roads. Because of this, the founder approached transportation with the same level of patience and precision used in casting and tuning. The journey from workshop to town was planned carefully, shaped by the terrain, distance, and the size of the bell. Most workshops sat on the edges of towns, where the sounds of hammering and furnace work bothered fewer people. When a bell needed to be transported, apprentices first cleared the path leading out of the workshop. They removed stones, swept dust or debris, and ensured that the ground was level. The founder inspected this path personally, walking slowly from the workshop door to the point where the road widened enough for carts or carrying frames. Even a small bump could shift the bell during loading, so the founder paid close attention to every detail. The first challenge was lifting the bell. Depending on its size, it could weigh anywhere from a few dozen kilograms to several hundred. Small bells could be carried by 2 apprentices using long wooden poles threaded through the bell's crown, the solid part at the top where iron supports would eventually be attached. Larger bells required wooden frames built specifically to cradle them. These frames had thick sides, reinforced beams, and straps made from strong leather. Apprentices tightened these straps carefully, checking them repeatedly. The founder supervised all of this with calm attentiveness. They instructed apprentices on where to place their hands, how to distribute their weight, and how to use slow, steady movements. Lifting a bell was never rushed. The founder often said that haste could undo weeks of patient work. Apprentices understood this well. They approached the task with seriousness beyond their usual duties. Once secured in the frame or suspended from wooden poles, the bell was lifted gradually. Workers tightened their grips, straightened their backs, and rose in unison, using the strength of their legs rather than their backs to avoid sudden jerks. The bell shifted only slightly, a sign that the group's coordination was effective. The founder walked beside them, ready to adjust their movements if needed. With the bell lifted, the journey began. If the bell was small, the workers carried it directly through the narrow roads leading toward the town center. But for larger bells, a cart was required. These carts were designed with thick wooden wheels and strong axles, capable of supporting the weight of bronze. Apprentices lined the inside with straw or wool sacks to absorb vibrations. Only when everything was ready did they lower the bell onto the cart, inch by inch, guided by the founder's calm voice. The path from workshop to town varied depending on location. Some workshops sat on rocky terrain, others on flatter ground. Roads were not smooth, and even minor hills required slow, careful movement. As the cart rolled forward, apprentices walked alongside it, adjusting ropes, watching the wheels, and listening for any irregular sounds. The founder remained at the front or side, observing the road ahead. Travelers passing by often paused to watch. Seeing a new bell on its way to a town was a moment of quiet significance. People understood the importance of bells in shaping daily life, marking mornings, signaling gatherings, guiding workers through their routines. A new bell meant change, structure, and a sense of unity for the community it would serve. For the founder, however, the journey was not symbolic. It was practical. Every movement mattered. When the cart approached uneven ground, the founder slowed the pace. Apprentices placed boards or stones to smooth dips in the road. If the cart had to cross a bridge, the founder checked its stability, running a hand along the railings and observing how the planks responded underfoot. They never hesitated to delay movement if something felt uncertain. In some regions, transportation required moving through narrow pathways or steep inclines. In those cases, the founder sometimes assigned additional workers to help guide the cart or steady the bell. These helpers positioned themselves strategically, ready to hold ropes or adjust balance. If the bell swayed even slightly, the founder paused the journey and waited until it settled. Rest stops were common on longer trips. The founder selected shaded spots where the bell could remain stable. Workers placed wooden blocks under the wheels of the cart and tightened the ropes again. The bell was checked for any signs of shifting or stress, even though such problems were rare when handled carefully. These pauses also gave the workers time to rest and drink water, ensuring that fatigue did not affect their coordination. When the bell finally reached the town, its arrival drew attention. Children watched from doorways. Merchants stepped out of their shops. Farmers on the outskirts paused their work. Even though bells were not rare, each one felt like an addition to the town's identity. It represented organization, communication, and structure. The founder observed these reactions quietly, knowing that the bell would soon become part of the soundscape of people's everyday routines. The next stage involved bringing the bell to its installation site. usually a tower, a hall, or a tall wooden frame built specifically for sound projection. Workers cleared the area and positioned ropes and pulleys. These pulleys were often simple, made from wood and reinforced with metal, but highly reliable. The founder inspected every piece, testing ropes for fraying and checking the pulleys for smooth rotation. Safety was paramount during installation, not because the craft involved danger, but because any slip could alter the bell's tone or damage its surface. Raising the bell required precise teamwork. Workers pulled ropes in coordinated rhythm, lifting the bell inch by inch. The founder guided from below, ensuring that the bell did not strike walls or support beams. When the bell reached its designated height, workers secured it with iron supports attached to strong wooden beams. These supports ensured that the bell could swing freely while maintaining stability. Before stepping back, the founder checked the installation one final time. They gently moved the bell to test its range of motion, listened to the creaks and shifts of the supports, and inspected the bolts and ropes. Only when completely satisfied did the founder give a small, approving nod. The first sound, the bell's initial ring, usually came later, sometimes hours or even a full day after installation. It did not mark an event or ceremony. Rather, it served as a functional test. A worker or assistant gently tapped the bell with a wooden beam or lifted it slightly to allow a small movement. The tone that emerged was calm, steady, and full, the true measure of the bell founder's work. The founder listened quietly. The tone carried through the air, resonating across rooftops and streets. It traveled farther than the founder's workshop, farther than the path taken during transportation. It reached corners of the town the founder did not see, connecting people to their routines in a way only sound could accomplish. That sound, simple and consistent, reflected every step of the journey. The careful mixing of bronze, the shaping of clay, the patient cooling, the attentive transport. For the founder, hearing it was a moment of quiet fulfillment. The bell no longer belonged to the workshop, it belonged to the town. Workers dispersed, returning tools and finishing their tasks. The founder lingered only a moment longer, listening to the fading resonance. Then, satisfied, they turned back toward the workshop where new molds, new metals, and new apprentices awaited their guidance. Transporting a bell, like casting one, required patience, discipline, and respect for the craft. It was a journey not defined by haste or spectacle, but by steady steps and quiet understanding. A journey that carried the bell from silent metal to a lasting voice in the life of a community. The craft of bell founding did not survive through written instruction manuals, nor through grand ceremonies or official schools. Instead, it lived quietly in workshops, passed from one generation to the next through patient guidance, observation, and repetition. Knowledge did not transfer in sudden moments of revelation, but in long stretches of everyday work. In the steady rhythm of stirring molten bronze, in shaping clay for molds, in lifting heavy frames with practiced coordination. Apprentices learned by watching, listening, and imitating the calm discipline of the master founder. This steady flow of knowledge formed the backbone of the craft and ensured that the sound of bells continued to shape the daily life of towns across centuries. Apprentices typically entered the workshop at a young age. They arrived not as skilled workers, but as curious learners ready to observe the world of metal and clay. The workshop's environment shaped their early impressions. The warmth of the furnace, the scent of clay drying in thick layers, the careful arrangement of tools along wooden boards, and the quiet assurance with which the master founded guided each task. These apprentices were not expected to understand the significance of everything immediately. Instead, they were introduced slowly, beginning with simple tasks designed to build both skill and patience. Their first responsibilities often involved cleaning tools, collecting wood, sweeping floors, or preparing clay mixtures. Though these tasks appeared small, they played essential roles in maintaining the workshop's steady rhythm. As apprentices performed them, they watched the master founder move through the workshop, shaping the mold core, adjusting the furnace fire, inspecting metal quality, or checking the thickness of clay layers. Each movement was deliberate. Even before apprentices touched more complex tools, they absorbed the calm pace and measured habits that defined the craft. Over time, apprentices began assisting with more challenging tasks. They learned how to mix clay with sand and fibers in precise proportions, The master taught them how to feel the texture, to know when the mixture held the right balance between firmness and flexibility. They learned to shape the clay around the core, pressing it gently to avoid air pockets. The master would occasionally pause to correct their hand movements, showing them how to smooth a surface with steadiness rather than force. These early lessons were not simply about making clay molds. They were lessons in patience, control, and sensitivity to material. Apprentices also learned to recognize metal quality long before it reached the furnace. The master showed them how to examine copper and tin, how the hue of each piece differed slightly based on its origin, how to test tin's softness with the pressure of the thumb, and how to determine whether impurities were present. These lessons required attention to subtle details. Apprentices learned to tilt each ingot under natural light, to listen for the faintest ring when two pieces of metal struck gently together, and to observe the weight and density of each amount placed on a scale. As their skills improved, apprentices were gradually introduced to the furnace, the heart of the workshop. This was a significant milestone, approached with careful preparation. The master explained the importance of maintaining a consistent flame, controlling airflow, and adding fuel at the right intervals. Apprentices practiced monitoring the fire before ever melting metal. They learned to sense the furnace's condition not only by its appearance, but also by the sound of burning wood and the movement of heat. When apprentices eventually assisted with melting the bronze, they did so cautiously. They stirred the molten metal using long-handled rods, following the master's instructions closely. Every action had purpose. Stir too quickly, and impurities could mix with the bronze. Stir too slowly, and the alloy might not blend evenly. Apprentices learned to skim dross from the surface without disturbing the main body of the metal. The master's voice guided them, calm and steady, correcting their timing and reminding them of the importance of subtle movements. Before apprentices participated in pouring bronze into a mold, they spent years observing. They studied how the master inspected the mold for readiness, how they measured ladle angles, how they coordinated with other workers during the pour. This coordination required more than strength. It required understanding how small movements affected flow. When apprentices eventually took part, they felt the significance of their role. The master offered instructions softly, ensuring that everyone moved in harmony. If apprentices felt tension or nervousness, the master's steady demeanor grounded them. Knowledge passed not only through direct instruction, but also through the atmosphere of the workshop. Apprentices learned when to remain quiet and when to ask questions. They learned that the craft did not reward hurry. In fact, hurrying led to mistakes that required even more time to fix. The master often reminded them that bell founding was a craft measured in days, not minutes. The sound of a bell reflected the time invested in every step of its creation. One of the most important aspects of the apprenticeship was learning to listen. Listening did not mean only hearing spoken instructions. It meant listening to the furnace, the mixing of clay, the settling of cooling bronze, and the first test tones of a newly cast bell. Apprentices trained their ears just as much as their hands. The master demonstrated how to recognize slight wavering in a bell's tone, how to identify whether a wall was too thick or thin, and how to use a wooden mallet to tap gently and observe resonance. Apprentices also learned how to maintain tools. Chisels needed sharpening. Wooden strickle boards required care to preserve their shape. The furnace demanded regular cleaning. Each piece of equipment played a small but essential part in the overall craft. Maintaining tools taught apprentices responsibility and respect for the workspace, lessons that shaped their future roles as master founders. As apprentices grew more confident, the master introduced them to tuning. This stage required precision beyond physical strength. The master explained how removing even a small amount of metal from the inner surface could change the bell's tone. Apprentices practiced on smaller pieces of bronze or old bells not destined for use. They learned to make tiny adjustments, tap again, listen, and adjust once more. Tuning was as much an art as a technical skill, and it took years to understand fully. There came a time in every apprenticeship when the master sensed readiness. This readiness was not measured by age, but by consistency. The ability to shape clay with confidence, to tend the furnace with care, to recognize metal quality instantly, and to work with others during pouring. When an apprentice reached this stage, the master entrusted them with greater responsibility. They poured portions of bronze under supervision, shaped molds independently, or tune small bells with minimal correction. These milestones were quiet, but deeply meaningful. The relationship between a master and an apprentice was built on trust. The master trusted the apprentice to follow instructions faithfully. The apprentice trusted the master's judgment, even when tasks felt repetitive or challenging. This trust developed over years of shared work in the same workshop through the daily rituals of preparation, crafting, and cleaning. Knowledge did not pass quickly. It settled slowly into the apprentice's habits until it became second nature. Eventually, some apprentices stayed to inherit the workshop, continuing the lineage of the craft. Others traveled to new towns, taking with them the techniques learned from their master. Regardless of where they went, the craft remained remarkably consistent because its foundation rested on universal principles: patience, careful observation, and respect for materials. These values transcended regions, allowing bell founding to maintain its identity across generations. In every town that received a new bell, few people understood the full story behind it. The years of training, the gradual learning, the attentive shaping of clay and metal. Yet the sound of the bell carried traces of its maker. It echoed the master's experience, the apprentice's careful practice, and the shared environment of the workshop. In this way, every bell was more than an object. It was a quiet testament to the slow transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. Bell founding survived centuries not because it was written down, but because people cared enough to preserve it through daily work. Apprentices watched, listened, practiced, corrected mistakes, and grew into the role. Masters guided, demonstrated, explained, and trusted. This cycle formed an unbroken chain that kept the craft alive long after many other medieval practices faded from memory. This chapter marks the heart of the craft, not just how bells were made, but how the knowledge behind them endured. It was a craft built on patience, respect, and steady hands, carried forward through countless quiet moments in countless workshops. Once a bell was installed and given its first careful tap, it began the next chapter of its existence, not in the workshop, but in the rhythms of daily life. While the founder returned to molds and furnaces, the bell stayed behind, becoming part of the town's acoustic landscape. Its sound shaped routines, guided work patterns, marked transitions, and offered a stable sense of structure to communities that depended on subtle cues for timing and coordination. The voice of the bell became as familiar as the turning of daylight, settling into the lives of people who often did not know the long, patient craft that had made such clarity possible. For many towns, the first regular ringing happened early in the morning. Before the sun settled over rooftops and fields, the bell's tone carried softly across streets. This sound was not meant to startle or demand haste. It served instead as a calm signal that the day had begun. Bakers preparing dough, merchants lifting shutters, and farmers preparing for work all recognized the gentle resonance as a reminder to begin their routines. Even those who were awake before the bell found comfort in its consistency. It was a sound that confirmed the time, offering reassurance that the day was unfolding as expected. The bell's voice traveled differently depending on the landscape. In valleys, it brushed softly against hillsides before echoing back with slightly prolonged resonance. In flat plains, it spread in wide, even waves that traveled farther than expected. In towns surrounded by wooden structures, the sound absorbed mildly, creating a softer effect. In stone-built towns, the bell's tone bounced off walls, producing a brighter, more focused quality. Communities grew so accustomed to this acoustic behavior that they unconsciously adjusted their routines to match how the sound traveled on different mornings. One of the most important characteristics of a bell was its steadiness. A clear, unwavering tone created a sense of reliability. People trusted the sound because they knew it had been shaped carefully. This trust formed over time, as residents noticed how the bell responded to their environment, ringing slightly longer on cooler mornings, sounding more mellow in dense fog, or carrying farther on crisp evenings. These small shifts were natural, but the core of the tone remained stable, reflecting the founder's precision. Throughout the day, the bell marked moments that helped organize work and communal activities. In some towns, midday ringing signaled a break, giving workers a pause before the second half of their tasks. Farmers heard the bell from fields beyond the town and used the sound to estimate time. Market vendors relied on the bell to coordinate opening hours, ensuring that trade began consistently across the square. The bell sound shaped not only individual routines, but shared expectations. The bell also served practical roles that people depended on. Some towns used specific ringing patterns to signal weather changes, not alarming ones, but simple cues passed down through local custom. Long, spaced tones might indicate the arrival of cooler air after warm mornings, helping shepherds or workers adjust their plans. Shorter, gentle tones sometimes marked the approach of scheduled communal activities, such as meetings, work rotations, or maintenance efforts assigned by the town's leaders. These signals were calm and consistent, integrated into daily life without urgency. Because bells played such steady roles in routine life, people noticed small differences in tone that might escape outsiders. When a bell produced slightly brighter resonance one day, someone might comment quietly about the air feeling cooler. If the tone felt a little more mellow, farmers might assume the day would warm slowly. These interpretations did not rely on superstition. Instead, they reflected generations of observation. The bell's voice became part of how communities read the environment, not predicting events, but acknowledging the subtle interplay between sound and surroundings. Bell founders rarely visited the towns after installation, but when they did, they sometimes paused to listen from a distance. Standing along the road or in an open field, a founder could hear how the bell interacted with local terrain and architecture. These moments held quiet satisfaction. The founder recognized the tone, noting how faithfully it preserved the clarity shaped in the workshop. They could detect how the bell's sound matured over time, gaining depth as its bronze aged naturally. Slight darkening of the metal-enriched resonance without altering pitch. For a founder, witnessing this evolution felt like revisiting familiar work after years had passed. Inside homes, the bell's voice blended with everyday sounds, the movement of doors, soft conversations, the steady rhythm of household tasks. Its presence offered a backdrop that never demanded attention but provided a sense of orientation. People went about their routines knowing that the bell's consistency anchored the day. Even children grew up recognizing the sound without consciously thinking about it. To them, the bell was as natural as the change of light throughout the day. In towns with multiple bells, often different sizes for different purposes, the tones created a layered soundscape. Larger bells produced deep, steady resonance that felt grounding. Smaller bells created lighter tones that carried through narrow streets with clarity. When used together, these bells offered gentle cues for specific moments, allowing communities to distinguish between them instantly. Though bells differed in size and tone, they shared a common origin: the patience and precision of the founder's craft. For communities near rivers or open fields, the bell's sound sometimes traveled all the way to distant edges of the landscape. Shepherds grazing animals on hillsides listened for the bell's familiar tone, knowing it marked certain parts of the day. Workers repairing fences or tending crops heard it as a steady reminder woven into the natural rhythm of wind and birdsong. Even travelers passing through villages noticed the sound, often pausing momentarily to identify the direction it came from. These travelers could sense the character of a town simply by listening, whether the bell's tone was bright, mellow, or deep. Over the years, as seasons changed and buildings aged, the bell continued its work without interruption. Rain softened its tone slightly, but never weakened it. Snow absorbed part of the sound, creating a more muted resonance that residents found comforting during colder months. Dense summer air carried the tone more slowly, giving it a lingering warmth. People grew accustomed to these seasonal variations, seeing them as natural shifts rather than flaws. The bell adapted seamlessly to each phase of the year, always providing the same consistent core tone. Occasionally, the bell's voice offered a moment of reflection for people who paused long enough to listen. Workers finishing their tasks late in the afternoon might hear its steady resonance reminding them that the day was nearing its end. Travelers hearing the bell from afar sometimes felt a sense of arrival, knowing they were nearing a community with routines anchored by a dependable sound. The bell, without intention or ceremony, symbolized continuity. In some towns, elders could recall earlier bells that sounded different, slightly higher, deeper, or more mellow. These memories formed part of the community's quiet history, shared not through written records, but through everyday conversations. When a new bell replaced an older one, residents took time to adjust to the change. They listened closely during the first weeks, comparing the new tone to the one they had known for years. Over time, the new bell's voice integrated fully into the town's identity, and people accepted it as naturally as the old one. Though most people never visited a bell founder's workshop, they carried the craft's results with them throughout daily life. The bell's sound informed routine decisions: when to begin tasks, when to gather tools, when to expect shifts in communal activity. Its tone offered quiet reassurance during uncertain seasons, acting as a stable presence even when weather or harvest shifted unexpectedly. Children who grew up with a particular bell often associated its sound with the passage of time. They could tell when midday approached without seeing the sky. They recognized late afternoon by the calm resonance drifting across rooftops. As they grew older, these same individuals carried the bell's memory with them, even when they traveled or settled elsewhere. The sound imprinted itself in their sense of place and routine. The bell also shaped communal spaces. Markets opened in harmony with the bell's tone. Workshops timed their shifts based on its calls. Even inns and gathering halls referenced the bell for scheduling. Long before mechanical clocks became widespread, communities relied on this sound to maintain shared rhythm. Over generations, the bell became an anchor in the town's character, not because of elaborate ceremonies or symbolic significance, but because of its steady, reliable presence. It was part of the environment, woven into the soundscape as naturally as birds, wind, or footsteps on cobblestone. Its voice carried the work of the founder into every corner of the community. The bell's sound lived with the people. It guided them quietly, connected their routines, and offered a familiar tone through the seasons. And long after the founder who created it moved on, or even after apprentices carried on the craft in new towns, the bell continued speaking, its voice steady and clear, shaped by the hands that poured, tuned, and cared for it. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the forgotten world of medieval bell founders, the people whose patience, skill, and steady hands shaped a sound that guided entire communities. If this calm journey helped you relax, unwind, or learn something new tonight, feel free to share your favorite moment in the comments. I always enjoy reading which part of the story stays with you. And if you'd like more peaceful history to fall asleep to, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more slow, gentle stories from the past. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next quiet chapter of history.